Sarah Caldwell stood at the edge of her late husband's ranch, her 6'3" frame casting a long shadow across the dusty Texas soil. At 32, she had never imagined herself a widow, let alone the owner of 300 acres she had no idea how to manage. The funeral had been 3 weeks ago, and the reality of her situation was finally beginning to sink in. Marcus had been the rancher, the one who understood cattle and crops and the delicate balance of running a successful operation. She had been the school teacher, content with her books and her students, never expecting to be thrust into this unfamiliar world. The ranch house behind her needed repairs she couldn't afford. The fences were falling apart in at least a dozen places. The cattle needed vaccinations and the crops needed tending, and the bank had started sending letters about the mortgage Marcus had taken out 6 months before his heart attack. Sarah felt small despite her height, crushed under the weight of responsibilities she never asked for and debts she didn't know existed. That's when she first saw Clayton Mercer's truck kicking up dust on the long driveway. She recognized the vehicle immediately. Everyone in Redstone County knew Clayton Mercer. He owned the largest spread in 3 counties, a cattle empire built over 40 years of shrewd business deals and relentless ambition. He was 68 years old, weathered by the sun and hardened by years of outdoor labor, but still strong and commanding in a way that made younger men step aside when he entered a room. Sarah's heart hammered as she watched him park and step out of his truck. She had heard the stories about Clayton Mercer. He had a reputation for buying up struggling ranches, always offering just enough to make desperate people sell, but never enough to call it generous. Marcus had despised him, calling him a vulture who circled wounded properties waiting for the kill. Now that vulture was walking toward her with measured steps, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, removing his hat in a gesture that seemed more habitual than respectful. "I'm sorry for your loss. Marcus was a good man, even if we didn't always see eye to eye." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She wrapped her arms around herself despite the heat, feeling exposed under his calculating gaze. Clayton looked past her toward the ranch, his eyes taking in every detail with the practiced assessment of a man who had evaluated hundreds of properties. "I'll get straight to the point," Clayton continued, his voice as rough as gravel. "You're in trouble here. This ranch is dying, and you don't have the experience or the capital to save it. The bank's going to foreclose in 6 months, maybe less. You'll lose everything and walk away with nothing." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had known things were bad, but hearing it stated so bluntly made her knees weak. She wanted to argue, to defend Marcus's legacy, but the numbers in the ledger she had been studying told the same story Clayton was telling now. "I'm prepared to make you an offer," Clayton said, his tone softening slightly. "It's fair, more than fair considering the circumstances. You'll walk away with enough to start fresh somewhere else. No debt, no burden. You can go back to teaching, live a normal life." Sarah finally found her voice. "This is my home. Marcus built this place from nothing. I can't just sell it to you like it means nothing." Clayton studied her face for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. "Then you're going to lose it anyway, and you'll have nothing to show for your stubbornness except bitterness and regret. I've seen it happen 100 times, Mrs. Caldwell. Pride doesn't pay mortgages." He placed a business card on the porch railing. "Think about it. You've got my number. But don't think too long. Every day you wait, this place is worth less." As Clayton drove away, Sarah picked up the card with trembling fingers. She looked out at the land Marcus had loved, at the dreams they had built together, and felt tears burning her eyes. She was terrified of losing everything, but she was equally terrified of giving up without a fight. That night, lying alone in the bed she had shared with Marcus, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't sell. She would find a way to save the ranch, even if it killed her trying. Sarah spent the next 2 weeks working herself to exhaustion. She woke before dawn to feed the cattle, spent her days mending fences with hands that blistered and bled, and collapsed into bed long after sunset. She watched YouTube videos on ranch management, called the county extension office with 1,000 questions, and slowly began to understand just how deep her problems ran. The more she learned, the more hopeless everything seemed. The bank called on a Tuesday morning. They wanted to meet. Sarah drove into town with a knot in her stomach, knowing what was coming. The loan officer, a thin man named Peterson with sympathetic eyes, laid out the situation with uncomfortable clarity. The ranch was 3 months behind on mortgage payments. Without a substantial payment within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. "Is there family who could help?" Peterson asked gently. "Anyone who might co-sign a loan?" Sarah shook her head. Her parents were gone. Marcus had been an only child. They had no children of their own. She was alone in every possible way. She left the bank in a daze and nearly collided with Clayton Mercer on the sidewalk outside. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow, his grip firm and warm. "Careful there," he said. Then, reading her expression, "Bad news?" Sarah pulled away from him, embarrassed by her tears. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You look like you've been hit by a truck." Clayton glanced toward the bank. "Peterson give you the ultimatum?" She didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. Clayton sighed heavily. "Come on. Let me buy you a coffee. You look like you need it." Sarah wanted to refuse, but she was too tired and defeated to argue. She followed him to the diner across the street, sliding into a booth while Clayton ordered 2 coffees at the counter. When he returned, he sat across from her and waited patiently while she collected herself. "I meant what I said," Clayton began. "My offer still stands. But I can see you're not ready to sell." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "So let me propose something different." Sarah looked up, wary. "What kind of something different?" "You need help. Not just money, but expertise. Someone who knows ranching inside and out, who can turn this operation around before the bank takes it." Clayton leaned forward, his weathered face serious. "I could be that someone. Let me manage the ranch. I'll cover the immediate debts, make the necessary improvements, handle the operations. In exchange, we split the profit 60-40, with you keeping the larger share." Sarah stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "Why would you do that? Why not just wait for me to fail and buy it for even less?" Clayton's jaw tightened. "Because I knew your husband longer than you think. Marcus and I had our differences, but I respected him. And because—" He hesitated, something vulnerable flickering across his features. "Because watching this place die when it could be saved would be a waste. Call it an old man's sentimentality." "There has to be a catch," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The catch is trust," Clayton replied. "You'd have to trust me to make decisions about your property. Trust me in your home, on your land, with your future. That's not easy, especially for someone in your position." Sarah's mind raced. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, another way for Clayton Mercer to take what he wanted. But another part of her, the desperate part that had been drowning in impossible circumstances, saw this as the lifeline she desperately needed. "I need time to think," she said. Clayton nodded. "You've got 24 hours. After that, my offer to manage expires. I'll go back to my original proposal to buy you out, and that number will be lower than before." He stood, leaving money on the table for the coffee. At the door, he turned back. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Caldwell, I don't make offers like this. Ever. But something about you reminds me of myself 40 years ago, desperate and determined and too stubborn to know when to quit. I'm giving you a chance I never got. Don't waste it on pride." That night, Sarah walked the ranch in the moonlight. She thought about Marcus, about the dreams they had shared, about the life she had imagined before everything fell apart. She thought about Clayton Mercer's offer and what accepting it would mean. By morning, she had made her decision. She called Clayton at dawn. "I accept. But I have conditions." "I'm listening," came his gruff reply. "I work alongside you. I learn everything. This is still my ranch, my responsibility. You're not just taking over while I stand aside." There was a pause, then something that might have been respect in Clayton's voice. "Fair enough. I'll be there in an hour. We've got a lot of work to do." The first month of their partnership was hell. Clayton arrived every morning at 5:30 without fail, and Sarah quickly learned that working alongside him meant keeping pace with a man who had been ranching since before she was born. He was demanding, critical, and absolutely unforgiving of mistakes. When she fed the cattle too slowly, he showed her once, then expected perfection. When she miscalculated feed ratios, he made her redo the entire calculation from scratch until she understood the math instinctively. But Clayton was also a remarkable teacher. His harsh criticism came paired with practical knowledge Sarah couldn't find in any book. He taught her to read weather patterns in the clouds, to spot illness in cattle before symptoms became obvious, to negotiate with suppliers until she got prices she didn't think possible. He showed her which parts of the ranch were profitable and which were bleeding money, then explained exactly how to fix the problems. The physical work nearly broke her. Despite her height and natural strength, Sarah's body wasn't conditioned for the relentless demands of ranch labor. Her hands developed calluses on top of calluses. Her shoulders ached from hauling feed bags. Her legs burned from hours in the saddle checking fences. She fell into bed each night too exhausted to dream, then woke before dawn to do it all again. Clayton never showed sympathy. When she complained about sore muscles, he told her to work through it. When she wanted to quit early because of the heat, he reminded her that cattle needed tending regardless of human comfort. He pushed her harder than anyone had ever pushed her, and Sarah found herself responding to the challenge with a determination she didn't know she possessed. The ranch began to transform. Clayton's money covered the immediate debts and funded crucial repairs. New fencing went up. The irrigation system got overhauled. They invested in better breeding stock and implemented a rotation grazing system that improved pasture quality dramatically. The changes weren't dramatic on a day-to-day basis, but week by week, Sarah could see her ranch coming back to life. The town noticed the changes too. People who had written off the Caldwell Ranch as a lost cause began commenting on the improvements. Some praised Sarah's determination. Others whispered about Clayton Mercer's involvement, speculating about his true intentions and what he was really getting out of the arrangement. Sarah heard the gossip but tried to ignore it, focused on the work that consumed her days. 3 months into their partnership, Sarah finally made a mistake that couldn't be easily fixed. She had been moving cattle between pastures, a routine task she had performed dozens of times. But she misjudged the timing on closing a gate, and 30 head of cattle broke through into the wrong section, trampling newly planted winter wheat. The damage represented thousands of dollars in lost crops and hours of wasted labor. Clayton discovered the disaster an hour later. Sarah was standing in the ruined field, fighting back tears of frustration and exhaustion, when she heard his truck approaching. She braced herself for the explosion of anger she knew she deserved. But Clayton surprised her. He climbed out of his truck, surveyed the damage, then walked to where she stood. For a long moment, he said nothing. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I know I cost us money we can't afford to lose. I'll work extra hours, I'll figure out how to make it up somehow." Clayton shook his head. "It's not about the money. Money can be recovered. What I need to know is whether you learned from this mistake." Sarah nodded emphatically. "I did. I was rushing, not paying attention to the timing. I thought I could save a few minutes by—" "Stop," Clayton interrupted. "Don't explain it to me. Explain it to yourself. Make sure you understand exactly what went wrong and why, so you never make the same mistake again. That's how you become a real rancher. Not by being perfect, but by learning from every failure." He turned to leave, then paused. "Marcus would be proud of you, you know. He'd see how hard you're working, how much you've learned. He'd see that you're fighting for what he built." The words hit Sarah harder than any criticism could have. She watched Clayton drive away, and for the first time since accepting his help, she felt something shift between them. He wasn't just her business partner or her reluctant teacher. He was becoming something more complicated, something she wasn't ready to examine too closely. That evening, as Sarah was finishing the day's final chores, Clayton returned unexpectedly. He found her in the barn, and his expression was more serious than usual. "We need to talk about the elephant in the room," he said without preamble. "People are talking. About you and me, about what's really happening here. Some of those rumors are getting ugly." Sarah felt heat rise to her face. "Let them talk. We know the truth." "Do we?" Clayton moved closer, and Sarah was suddenly aware of how alone they were, how intimate the dim barn felt. "Because sometimes I'm not sure what the truth is anymore, Sarah." It was the first time he had used her first name. The shift between them after that conversation in the barn was subtle but undeniable. Clayton still arrived every morning with the same demanding expectations, but there was a new awareness in how he looked at her, how he stood just a bit closer when explaining something, how his hand lingered a moment longer when he steadied her dismounting from a horse. Sarah told herself she was imagining it, that exhaustion and loneliness were playing tricks on her mind. But she felt it too, a pull toward this complicated man who had become central to her daily existence. The ranch continued improving. 6 months into their partnership, they had not only caught up on the mortgage but had started turning a modest profit. The cattle were healthy and multiplying. The crops were thriving. Sarah had transformed from a desperate widow fumbling through unfamiliar work into a capable rancher who could hold her own in conversations with the other landowners in the county. But success brought new complications. Clayton's original ranch, the massive spread that dwarfed her property, demanded his attention too. He began spending less time at her place, delegating some tasks and trusting her to handle daily operations independently. Sarah was proud of his confidence in her abilities, but she also felt his absence more acutely than she expected. The ranch felt emptier without his truck in the driveway, without his gruff voice calling instructions across the pasture. One evening in late autumn, a massive storm system swept across the county with little warning. Sarah was alone at the ranch when the sky turned an ominous green and the wind began howling with terrifying force. She rushed to secure the animals, moving with the efficiency Clayton had drilled into her, but the storm was moving too fast. Rain began falling in sheets, visibility dropped to almost nothing, and Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of tin roofing being ripped from one of the outbuildings. She was struggling to get the last of the horses into the barn when Clayton's truck came racing up the drive. He was out before the vehicle fully stopped, running through the rain to help her. Together they worked frantically, securing animals and equipment as the storm intensified around them. A lightning strike hit close enough that Sarah felt the electricity in the air, and suddenly Clayton's arm was around her, pulling her toward the barn's relative safety. They stumbled inside, both soaking wet and breathing hard. The storm raged outside, shaking the barn's walls and filling the air with the sound of wind and rain and thunder. In the dim light filtering through the cracks, Sarah was intensely aware of Clayton's proximity, of his arms still around her shoulders, of the way they were both shaking from adrenaline and cold. "You shouldn't have come," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "It's dangerous. You think I'd leave you to handle this alone?" Clayton's voice was rough with emotion. "You think I could sit at my place knowing you were here in the middle of this?" Sarah looked up at him, water dripping from her hair, and saw something in his expression that took her breath away. It wasn't the professional concern of a business partner or the detached care of a mentor. It was raw and vulnerable and terrifying in its intensity. "Clayton," she whispered, not sure what she was asking for. He seemed to struggle with himself, his jaw tight. "I told myself I was doing this for Marcus. For the ranch. Because it was the right thing to do." His hand moved to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "But that stopped being true months ago, and we both know it." Sarah should have stepped back. Should have reminded him of the age difference, of the power dynamics, of Marcus's memory, of all the sensible reasons this was a terrible idea. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to rest on his chest where she could feel his heart hammering. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "Of this, of what it means, of what people will say." "Too big," Clayton murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "That's what you're thinking. This feeling, this situation, it's all too big and too complicated and too much." Sarah nodded, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "Then just sit on it," Clayton said softly. "That's what my father used to tell me when I was overwhelmed. When something's too big to face all at once, you just sit on it. You live with it, day by day, until it doesn't feel so impossible anymore." The barn went quiet except for the storm outside and the sound of their breathing. Sarah made her decision in that moment, stepping closer instead of pulling away. Clayton's arms came around her, and when he kissed her, it felt like falling and flying at the same time, terrifying and inevitable and absolutely right. They stayed in the barn until the storm passed, holding each other while the wind howled and the rain pounded the roof. They didn't talk about what came next or what this meant for their partnership or how they would face the judgment they both knew was coming. For once, Sarah wasn't thinking about the future or the past. She was simply present, sitting on the overwhelming reality of her feelings, letting herself be terrified and hopeful and alive. When the storm finally broke and pale light filtered through the clouds, they walked back to the house hand in hand. The ranch had taken damage, nothing catastrophic but enough to mean days of repair work. Sarah looked at the bent fencing and scattered debris and felt not despair but determination. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Clayton squeezed her hand. "We should talk about this. About us, about how we move forward." Sarah nodded. "We should. But not tonight. Tonight I just want to sit with this, with you, and not think about all the reasons it's complicated." Clayton smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "I can do that." Winter came early that year, bringing with it both challenges and unexpected blessings. Sarah and Clayton's relationship was no longer a secret, though they made no grand announcements. The town noticed, of course. Redstone County was too small for secrets. The gossip ranged from supportive to cruel, with some people praising Sarah's practical decision to secure her ranch's future and others whispering about gold-digging widows and foolish old men. Sarah learned to ignore the talk, mostly. Clayton had weathered decades of public scrutiny and had developed a thick skin she tried to emulate. What mattered wasn't what the coffee shop crowd thought. What mattered was the ranch thriving, the animals healthy, and the quiet contentment she felt when Clayton's truck pulled into her driveway each morning. The age difference that had seemed so insurmountable at first gradually became irrelevant. Clayton's 68 years had given him wisdom and patience that men half his age lacked. He treated Sarah as an equal partner in every decision, respecting her judgment even when it differed from his own. And Sarah discovered that her youth brought energy and fresh perspectives that complemented Clayton's experience perfectly. In February, the bank called with unexpected news. Based on the ranch's remarkable turnaround and strong financial projections, they were offering to refinance the mortgage at significantly better terms. Sarah hung up the phone in shock, then immediately called Clayton to share the news. His pride in her accomplishment was evident even through the phone. "You did this," he insisted when she tried to credit him. "You saved this place through hard work and determination. I just showed you which direction to go." The spring brought calving season, always a critical time for any cattle operation. Sarah worked around the clock monitoring the herd, assisting with difficult births, caring for newborns. Clayton was by her side through it all, patient during her panic over a struggling calf, proud when she successfully handled a complicated delivery without his help. One warm April evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Clayton reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Sarah recognized Marcus's handwriting immediately. "He gave this to me 2 years before he died," Clayton said quietly. "Made me promise to give it to you if anything happened to him and if I thought you needed it." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single page in Marcus's familiar scrawl. "My darling Sarah," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm guessing you're scared and overwhelmed and probably angry at me for leaving you with this mess. I'm sorry. I never meant for things to get so complicated. I never meant to leave you alone. But here's what I need you to know: you are stronger than you think. Braver than you believe. You have everything it takes to not just survive, but to thrive. Don't be afraid to accept help. Don't be afraid to love again. Don't be afraid to build a new life that's different from the one we planned together. I'll always love you, but I don't want you trapped by that love. Be happy, Sarah. That's all I ever wanted for you." And if Clayton Mercer is the one reading you this letter, well, I guess my instinct about him was right after all. He's a good man, even if he'd never admit it. Trust him. Let him help you. Let him care for you if that's where this goes. You have my blessing, always. Love, Marcus. Sarah was crying by the time she finished reading, tears streaming down her face. Clayton wrapped an arm around her shoulders and let her cry, understanding that these were tears of grief and relief and gratitude all mixed together. "He knew," Sarah whispered. "Somehow he knew." "Marcus was smarter than either of us gave him credit for," Clayton replied. As spring turned to summer, the ranch became everything Sarah had dreamed it could be. The pastures were lush with healthy grass. The cattle were prime stock that attracted buyers from across the state. The vegetable garden Clayton had helped her plant was producing more than they could eat. Sarah had hired 2 ranch hands, young men eager to learn who reminded her of herself a year ago, terrified and determined in equal measure. In July, Clayton surprised her by suggesting they combine their operations officially. Not a buyout or a takeover, but a true merger that would create one of the most successful ranches in the region. They spent weeks working out the details with lawyers, ensuring both their interests were protected and the legacy Sarah wanted to preserve for Marcus's memory remained intact. On the day they signed the papers, Sarah stood in the lawyer's office and felt the weight of the past year settle over her. She had gone from terrified widow to confident rancher, from drowning in debt to building something sustainable and profitable, from lonely and lost to loved and supported. The journey had been harder than anything she could have imagined, but also more rewarding than she ever dreamed possible. That evening, she and Clayton rode out to the far pasture where Marcus was buried. She had planted wildflowers around his grave, and they were blooming in a riot of colors. Sarah dismounted and knelt beside the headstone, Clayton standing respectfully behind her. "Thank you," she said softly, speaking to Marcus's memory. "For believing I could do this. For the letter. For understanding what I needed even before I did." Clayton's hand rested gently on her shoulder. "You ready to head back?" Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her knees. She looked out over the land that was now fully, truly hers in a way it had never been when Marcus was alive. She had earned this place through sweat and tears and determination. She had faced her fears and found herself capable of more than she ever imagined. "I'm ready," she said, taking Clayton's hand. As they rode back toward the ranch house in the fading light, Sarah reflected on that first day when Clayton had told her the ranch was too big for her to handle alone. He had been right, in a way. It was too big, too complicated, too overwhelming for anyone to manage without help. But instead of running from that impossible challenge, she had learned to sit with it, to live with the fear and uncertainty until it became manageable, until she grew into someone who could handle the weight of it all. The ranch lights glowed warm and welcoming as they approached. Sarah thought about dinner waiting in the oven, about the plans they had for fall planting, about the future stretching out before them full of possibility. She thought about how sometimes the biggest, most terrifying challenges become the very things that transform us into who we were always meant to be. Clayton squeezed her hand. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah smiled. "I'm thinking about how something can feel too big and impossible one day, and then one day you look around and realize you've grown big enough to hold it all." "You've come a long way from that scared woman I met in the driveway," Clayton observed. "We both have," Sarah replied. "I learned how to be a rancher. You learned how to trust someone enough to build something together instead of always working alone." They put the horses away together, working in the comfortable silence of two people who had learned each other's rhythms. As they walked toward the house, Sarah looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. She thought about Marcus, about her former self, about all the versions of her life that could have been but weren't. This was her life now. Her ranch, her partner, her hard-won success. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was richer and fuller and more genuinely hers than anything she could have imagined. And standing on her porch with Clayton's arm around her waist, looking out over land she had saved through determination and courage, Sarah Caldwell felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt at home.